Welcome to Parallel Perspectives, conversations with leaders who don't just think differently, they build differently. I'm Nathan Trail. Today's episode explores what happens when technology stops being a support function and becomes essential to mission delivery. We sit down with a leader navigating one of healthcare's most complex IT ecosystems, where every decision impacts not just systems, but human lives. If you're curious about leading through high-stakes transformation while staying grounded in purpose, this episode is for you. Sarah's journey starts far from the boardroom in small-town Wisconsin, where hard work wasn't optional. She studied English, not computer science, and found her way into technology through a paper-classified ad that led her to Epic Systems. Then, a scrappy, growing EHR company that would eventually reshape an industry. Over the years, Sarah's path has taken her coast to coast, from consulting roles at Sutter Health and New York City Health and Hospitals to executive leadership at Cleveland Clinic, where she now leads one of the most complex IT ecosystems in the world. Her story is one of service, stewardship, and redefining what it means to lead with empathy and clarity. Sarah, welcome to Parallel Perspectives. We are so thrilled to have you.
Thank you so much, Nathan. It's a pleasure to be here and to chat with you today.
Awesome. So, Sarah, we spoke a little bit already. You grew up in Wisconsin, working multiple jobs, including milking cows before sunrise. How did those early experiences shape your mindset and work ethic?
Yeah, that's all very true. I have pictures to prove that I was in the cow barn at 3 a.m. or 3 p.m. for a couple of summers. Also had a number of odd jobs, uh, working all sorts of different things. And I think it's a great question because sort of this idea of a Midwestern work ethic is not only something I identify with, but really is a rich foundation when you think about modern leadership. Many of its core traits, humility, resilience, authenticity, even community orientation, are exactly what makes today's best leaders. And I think we're really rediscovering and operationalizing that through more modern themes like inclusion, servant leadership, and purpose-driven culture.
Yeah, that's great. So, are there any lessons from that chapter of your life, when you're early on, that still show up in how you lead a technology team today?
Well, there are these sort of Midwestern colloquialisms, and I think they're valuable, right? So, one Midwestern trait would be, don't think less of yourself, just think of yourself less. And I think this is really important because people are raised to value contribution over recognition, and you measure your success by kind of your collective achievements, both individually and on a team. And I think some of the best senior leaders today really embody that through servant leadership, leading from behind, empowering teams, and really making rooms for others' voices. And in healthcare, especially, humility translates to really listening to our caregivers, listening to our patients as the experts in their own lived experience. I think another big one is reliability and integrity. So a big Midwestern quip would be, say what you mean and do what you say. And I think that follow through, that dependability, keeping one's word, are all cultural cornerstones from that area of the country and elsewhere, I'm sure. But in a world full of complexity and change, I really do think credibility is currency. And leaders who consistently deliver, admit mistakes, act transparently, foster that psychological safety and long-term trust. And I think that's really key to high-performing teams.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good lesson learned from early on, especially learning that Wisconsin work ethic really does translate into overall leadership when you're leading in a large organization. Is there a defining moment back then when you realized I want to build something bigger for myself, bigger than milking cows?
To be honest, that was never a mindset for me. I've always let my compass be set towards like, how can I be of service? How can I make an impact? I never really saw myself as a leader. It just sort of came naturally because of that mindset. And perhaps that makes the best leaders, right? It's never about you and achieving a greater purpose. And in fact, I think many, just to tie back to Midwestern work ethic, like I think you let your work speak for yourself, and it sort of goes from there. Like there's nothing wrong with putting in a good day's work, and in fact, that's something to be super proud of.
So, Sarah, you started as an English major who wanted to work in publishing. How did you go from literature to leading enterprise technology?
Yeah, you alluded a little bit to this in the intro. I didn't start in technology. I started in kind of the liberal arts and in stories. And what really appealed to me about that is I love how language really shapes understanding and writing generates creative thinking. I actually spent quite a bit of time doing some creative writing. And I really thought I'd end up in publishing just because that was kind of where I got my energy, where I spent time. But what I didn't realize is that there's a lot of parallels. Managing technology is just really another form of kind of storytelling and using that creativity. It's really how organizations express their work and kind of connect people at scale. And I think this is really true in leadership. Most people don't understand that for technology, it's on us to explain our strategy as a really great story. Where are we? Where are we going? And why does it matter? And that kind of narrative storytelling is really what moves people to a deeper level of understanding and engagement.
Creative writing, it feels as if creative writing is becoming a lost art. And
Absolutely. In
it's
the world of AI, you could just type
right.
in, write me a song, write me a poem. I find them not very interesting. Uh,
Well, then you better not read my birthday cards that I send my mom.
that's hilarious.
But it really is. It's a lost art. It's a skill set that not a lot of people have, not just from, being good at it or having the gift, but also having the experience. And I feel like that's something that is going to eventually go away because of AI, to your point. It's so I think it's pretty interesting that you started off with a strong gift of creative writing, but ended up running technology. There has to be some thread that helps guide or something that differentiates Sarah Hatchett from other technology leaders because of that experience. So I want to poke at that creative writing thing for a second, if you don't mind. Like, do you see any parallels to your current role versus having that unique experience of being a creative writer?
I definitely think that, just to go back to the AI thing, there is something creative about prompting and being able to ask the right questions. And so I think that at its core, being great at technology has to do with that curiosity, kind of pushing the boundaries, figuring out what are the key problems we're trying to solve, and then how do we solve them using technology. It's actually a really creative process. And even at its core, like building solutions is basically a semantic nature, right? Like you have to think about how do I break this problem down and actually create something that solves what the problem is we're trying to address.
Yeah, I actually find it one of the unique skill sets that I have that translates more into just sales or go to market is I actually, and a lot of people don't know this about me, by the way, is I was a thespian. I was in drama probably for 12 years, learning various skill sets, like thinking on your feet. And I think there's a lot of, lost art type things that I think our generations have had that hopefully future generations will continue to have. Hopefully AI doesn't steal that from, my children and my children's children, that they continue to strengthen those human muscles like creative writing or thinking on the fly and things like that. So you did mention Epic intentionally hires people without technical backgrounds. How did that influence your approach to leadership?
Yeah, I think, Epic is a very unique company. They have a methodology that they use to sort of select for smart, curious, driven people as opposed to kind of their technology background. And I do think that really shaped how I thought about leadership. It taught me that potential, that curiosity, that problem solving mindset is matters more than your credentials or your background. And I think you really can learn anything within the right framework. I learned early you don't always have to have the answer. You just have to know how to ask the right questions. And that mindset really changes everything when you're leading teams across disciplines. Epic had their own playbook, and they were super strong on culture. There was monthly staff meetings where the entire company came into physically into the room to kind of hear from the CEO where we headed and why are we doing what we're doing. There were, corporate commandments posted in every conference room and every bathroom, and really as a company they even rely on their culture to really do sales. Like they don't have a strong sales team. They kind of want you to get to know them and develop a relationship and kind of get indoctrinated into kind of the culture of, of their company. And I think at the bottom line, like you have to know why, what's your purpose. You can, without that kind of at the central focus, you can get lost or burn out. And so, I think just in the way that they're structured, the way that they focus on culture, they really put this focus on the fact that your ideas and your energy manage more than your title. And that's really shaped how I try to lead today. That try not to focus on hierarchy. You want to amplify good ideas and let the best thinking and the results kind of win the day.
Yeah, that's so focusing on your identity, what value you drive into the organization versus title is a lot of things I think people forget. And that separates, I think, from a leadership style perspective, it separates a lot of leaders. And, I've noticed that in talking to you, you very much are a lead from the front, but you're also very much an empowering leader from what I can understand. And we're going to get into that a little bit. But when you joined Epic, clearly a gorilla in the healthcare space. Is that really what got you into healthcare? Is your move to Epic? And I'm guessing you didn't go to Epic did you go into Epic to get into healthcare or to go to Epic to get into technology? Which one came first?
Well, to be honest with you, like I said, I was sort of lost with my liberal arts degree and like, what am I going to do? I think I was actually in about my third interview with Epic where I was like, what the heck even is this place? It was so quirky, and this was circa 2004 when like EHRs weren't really a strong thing in the market. Um, I started there really kind of before the boom and before meaningful use, before it became kind of commonplace to have healthcare technology in embedded into the delivery model. And so I honestly sort of landed in that space, and I found I absolutely loved it. I loved bringing forward solutions. I loved being in patient care settings. I love the mission of healthcare, and I've just never looked back.
That's good. And so that led you over time to Cleveland Clinic, one of the number one brand healthcare organizations in the world. I think Cleveland Clinic's mission is to be the best place to receive care and the best place to work in healthcare. So, how does technology contribute to that vision in your mind?
Yeah, when I actually started at Cleveland Clinic back in 2017, we had kind of like the strategic plan, and there were like all of these pillars, and technology was a pillar. So it was certainly important and surfaced as a key factor. But now, fast forward almost 10 years later, technology is undergirding the entire strategy. There's a deep ambition to sort of use technology to transform healthcare. And so I think that's a really exciting time to be not only at a world class organization, but to have one that recognizes the importance of technology in its mission. And one thing that we really try to take to heart is, the best place to work in healthcare, technology plays a huge role in the experience of work. And we want to make a frictionless experience. We don't want to add technology that hinders. We want to add technology that excites and empowers. And so I think more and more our clinical and operational leaders are not only recognizing the dependency, but the opportunity to how to leverage technology to truly advance the mission. And it's super exciting. I absolutely love Cleveland Clinic. I joke, I bleed blue and green. It's super exciting to be working with the people who are truly leading the industry in the clinical space. And my goal for IT is we can lead the industry in the technology space as well.
That I like that, and of course you have a pretty strong team. I'll just give a shout out to your CTO Shibu, who we've spent a lot of time with. He's fantastic, but it's almost as if I want to go back to what you said about technology and healthcare. It's almost, if you look at the paradigm of and the timeline of technology and healthcare, it's almost as if technology was a supporter, but now we've moved into an element of technology being an enabler for, going, driving innovative healthcare. And it's almost at some point in time, it's going to become a requirement. Like back end data centers supports the system. Now we're enabling more and more, faster caregiver services for patients. Um, at some point in time there, and I think we're kind of at that pinnacle moment, and I'd lean on you're definitely more of an expert at this than I am, but at some point in time there's a pinnacle in which it shifts from enabling to actual being truly a part of the healthcare giving process, and I think we're right at that tipping point. Do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, a neighboring company here in Cleveland is Progressive. Their headquarters are here as well. You saw that shift, right? They're a technology company that sells insurance. And that's how they've based their entire model, their entire strategy. And I don't think healthcare is ever going to get to that point, right? Like we still have to keep our patients and the clinical care at the center of what we do. But the more and more technology becomes the way in which we deliver care, it becomes a non-negotiable, right? It has to continue to be innovative. It has to be highly reliable. It has to be safe and secure. I mean, talk about not only a 24/7 operation, but like lives are on the line. And so I think it becomes even more important that we're not just investing, but innovating with technology to continue to drive the mission forward.
I love that Cleveland Clinic refers to its employees as caregivers. I never go into Cleveland Clinic's offices and hear the word employee. It just doesn't exist. That's clearly a critical value for Cleveland Clinic, and I love it because it truly is. No matter where you are, whether you're a nurse or a janitor, right? You're a caregiver, and what you do matters. So I'm curious how that value changes how you build teams today and design technology around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very proud to be a caregiver. It really helps connect back to that mission that we play a role. But I would add, not only are we caregivers, but we're also patients. So nearly all of our 80,000 caregivers are also part of our employee health plan. And what I think that really resonates is you want the best for your family, and you have to care for the Cleveland Clinic like it's your home, because in many ways it is. Like we're driven to continue to provide that care. In fact, we have kind of a moral obligation. If we truly believe we're the best place to receive care, we have a moral obligation to continue to expand and grow and offer care in increasing access, going to new markets. These are the sorts of things that fuel the mission because we're driven, right? Like we want what we have and we want to be able to share it with the world.
Is there something that you use? So we talked a little bit about technology shifting in healthcare, becoming more of an enabler and being more frontline. So when you're driving 2, 3 year plans, what is your thought process around maintaining a balance between innovation, technological innovation, and the clinic's deep sense of humanity?
Yeah, I think it's super important. One of our other sort of subtitles to Cleveland Clinic is patients first. I think it can be really challenging due to the complexity of the healthcare industry and, you know, maintaining operations, doing all these things. It can be really difficult to kind of keep that patient at the center. And so I love that we're super focused on that. I think at this current phase of technology innovation that we're seeing cross industry, it's more important than ever that we're thinking about how do we benefit our patients. A lot of these technologies, especially with AI and generative AI, are patient facing. So it's opening a whole new sense of opportunity of like how do we engage with our patient population in addition to our core clinical caregiver community. I think that it's sort of this dichotomy of like Gen AI is not really a human thing, but care delivery processes are so human dependent. So in terms of like how do we crack the code and increase access and continue to serve the mission, I think there's a lot of thought and opportunity about like how do we surface these tools for the benefits of our patients that also serve the organization?
Well, and that also speaks to your background in creative thinking and creative writing. It's almost like this role was designed for you. It's
I'm like,
being in technology. Being in technology is tough to get back to your customers because you're always behind a curtain, and it's how do I put my folks in front of the curtain so that they can see what they do matters and what they do has a sense. So it's almost driving that culture back into the technology front, and that's not an easy thing to do. When and if you're on the front lines, you can see it, you live it, you smell it, you touch it on a daily basis. But in technology, it's a bit tough. So I think that's a tough balance. So I appreciate the fact that and acknowledge that that's not easy.
well, yeah, and I think, you know, we're a 100-year-old organization. Technology's been around for a good number of those years. There's a fair amount of technical debt that we have, just like any other organization. You always have to kind of balance, like, where should we spend our time? Where should we spend our resources? Do we invest in kind of the behind the scenes thing that we know needs to get done, but maybe doesn't have any value or benefit to either the organization or our patients, or do you lean into the value side of the organization? So we've been talking a lot here about how do we drive greater business value, and how do you balance the time that you spend as it relates to kind of managing the technology portfolio. Super tricky because there are always going to be technology for the sake of technology needs. But if you balance that with the business value, it creates that sort of great ecosystem where you can certainly drive efficiency and sustainability while also then reinvesting in innovation.
Well, and I think this is a great opportunity for me to talk about how as a service integrator, so NRI is a service provider working with organizations like the Cleveland Clinic and others. We have, as service providers and service integrators, so partners to Cleveland Clinic, we have to also continuously remember we're not just selling technology, we're not just selling services, right? We're selling a solution that drives value to the patients. And I constantly try to remind my sales organization and the architects that are building these solutions behind the scenes that it's not just a server or a network switch or a domain or an Active Directory or a SharePoint. It is a solution that drives efficiency into the caregiver process that ultimately results in better experience for patients and ultimately drives more value-added times for nurses and doctors to save lives. And if we remember that, as we remember that, I feel like it becomes more of a partnership between service providers and healthcare providers, or healthcare organizations, versus just selling solutions. And so I feel like that's something that not just your internal IT organization has to remember, but also service providers such as NRI as well. Let's talk about your leadership style for a second. So we've talked a little bit about how you take a servant leader mindset, and I really appreciate that. But you don't do it in a passive sense. And I think some people misunderstand the word servant leader. So I'm curious your perspective. What does effective servant leadership look like to you?
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, servant leadership gets a bad rap, and it's not really about being like passive or agreeable or people pleasing. It's more about being purposeful. It means that if you serve the mission, you serve the people and the outcomes with equal intensity. Um, Being servant leader doesn't mean you're avoiding the hard decisions. It means you make decisions in the service of others. And that's really like what we've been talking about here, right? Keeping the patients at the center, our caregivers, and the organization's long-term health are all things that we need to fight for, and actively pursue. So being a servant leader doesn't mean that you're passive in any way. In fact, it's a very grounded leadership in purpose and not ego. You serve others by kind of lifting them up, even when it means standing firm. And that's really how you build trust and how you sustain transformation.
I like that, being purposeful. And a lot of folks, it's tough for leaders and people, who are being led to understand the difference sometimes between passion and and purpose. And it's sometimes as leaders, we've got to step back and make sure and this is a great podcast we had with Onkar at Hilton Grand Vacations, is understanding your people, understanding your audience, and being empathetic to the fact that sometimes your passion gets misinterpreted. And I'm definitely one who has not perfected that art. I'm a very passionate human, and sometimes I have to think back, take a step back. Are people interpreting my passion as assertiveness versus purposeful? Even though intention is there, it doesn't always act out that way. So how do you, Sarah, balance serving your team with serving the organization as a whole and the mission?
Yeah, I think that's super important, and I love the point that you made about sort of that subtle fine line between passion and purpose, and I think sometimes passion, you know, sort of lends itself. You kind of get stuck, right? Like you kind of get your blinders on, and you're like, I'm just super passionate about this topic. Meanwhile, I do think leadership calls you to definitely keep looking left and right, to re-examining the data, to asking those curious questions. And I think sometimes if you lean too far into the passion side, you're not thinking about that purpose. Why am I here? What am I being asked to do? I think sometimes you can kind of get caught in that space. As far as your question though, balancing kind of the team and the organization as a whole, I think one thing I underestimated about executive leadership is just the frequency and the pace in which you're expected to make tough decisions. I sometimes at the end of the day, I come home and I'm like, I don't want to decide anything. My husband's like, what do you want for dinner? I'm like, I don't care. I cannot make other decisions, right? Like you kind of get almost like fatigued with just the amount of important decisions that have to be made. So I think one way I try to balance that is really kind of staying grounded and trying to rise above some of those things, recognizing when there isn't enough data or we haven't spent enough time on a topic, and really just kind of saying like, actually, now is not the time to make a decision. And I think that's super important, because you can often feel pressure to just kind of like making decisions. I think, more and more, because we're just as an industry in really tough times, I think it can be challenging to kind of say like, let me look at it from all these different lenses, like what's best for my team, what's best for the organization, what's best for our patients, like just being able to kind of like keep that perspective and maintain that perspective is definitely challenging. I do think as a service organization, we have this natural ability to sort of like think about the organization well, but if we don't focus on the team, then you do the organization a disservice as well. So it can definitely feel really tricky, again, just given the pace and the amount of decisions that need to be made in this seat.
I love the analogy of putting on different lenses. That's important. And stepping back from tough decisions versus before making them, and actually saying, okay, let me put the lens of this, perspective on. Let me put the lens of this perspective. And then stepping back and then looking at all perspectives and trying. And a lot of times, if it's a high pressure, you don't have time to do that. There's not a lot of time, but I think it's important that we try to figure out. And I think that's a skill set that's built through experience as a leader, and building a muscle of being able to think through different perspectives fast, not having to go take 3 days in a cabin in the woods to take and read a book about different perspectives. That there's not a lot of time for that in business sometimes. So building that muscle of being able to put on different lenses and evaluate various perspectives quickly in high pressure stakes is important. And you talked a little bit about staying grounded when it's hard to make a decision. What are some practices you can give for other leaders to try to stay grounded when decisions just aren't popular to make?
Yeah, absolutely. Curiosity feels like it's been a theme of our talk today. Like I think that's super important, making sure that you're asking questions, making sure that you're hearing from the subject matter experts. So that would be one. The second, you mentioned the team, right? Like I can't underscore how amazing my team is here. And to some extent, they've entrusted me to kind of like make those decisions, but in return, I trust them to make sure that they're educating me, that they're surfacing up the information, that they're helping to groom the information in such a way. And I have such a deep respect and trust for my team to be able to kind of like watch for those blind spots when they're happening. And a lot of our leadership meetings, that I'm sort of like saying, like, what are we missing here, guys? Like, what do we need to take into consideration? What haven't we talked about? So I think that really kind of like collaborative decision making process is super important and a great element of servant leadership as well. And then I think the last thing, we've talked a lot about purpose, right? Like I think you literally have to wake up every day and have that little sticky note on your monitor, like, why am I here? What am I supposed to be doing here? What's been entrusted to me, and how can I steward that in the best way possible? And if you're not keeping that front and center, it's so easy to get lost or sidetracked or, like I mentioned, burned out.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of my key takeaways from this conversation is remembering purpose. You can't have passion without purpose, and I think what happens is people forget. They start that way and they forget that there's a purpose. And yeah, that's really good, Sarah. Let's shift a little bit to obviously a very popular topic in the world, and artificial intelligence. So you've talked about in the past conversations, AI is only as good as the data it has access to, which 1,000% we agree. That's our job, is from an NRI perspective, is to do data cleansing, data governance, stuff like that. In your opinion, what's the biggest challenge in connecting that data across healthcare systems?
Yeah, it's a super big challenge. I think it's interesting. The CIO title, the I is information. It's really data. That's really kind of like how we've created the technology discipline, is focused on how do we send and receive information. And I think, even despite all the innovation, there's still some core fundamental flaws in the frameworks that we've established, both as organizations as an industry. Who owns the data? How is the data being exchanged? The lack of standards around, that have been fully adopted by the industry, certainly makes that challenge, as well as, just as I mentioned, technical debt, some of the aging, software applications and infrastructure that are out there. We're 100, like I mentioned, we're a 100-year-old organization. I doubt any of my applications date back 100 years, but there are some really old applications there.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that the awesome thing about AI is it does hold some promise in us being able to leapfrog some of these things. For example, in EHRs, because EHR is my background, you can really think of them almost as like 20-plus-year-old data warehouses, right? Like, we have been collecting data on our patients and our care for decades, and yet we've not been able to really unlock that richness of data to provide real-time insights that can actually help inform and drive care at the individual level as well as across populations. And AI is really starting to deliver on that promise. So it's a super exciting time to be in healthcare, because you're finally able to use reasoning agents and to identify trends and to predict where things are going. Of course, predictive analytics have been around for a long time, but we're finally able to now surface that within the workflow, so that clinicians can actually in the workflow make real-time decisions that improve your care outcomes. And that's just super, super exciting promise.
It is exciting, and what I've noticed, very similar to what you said, is throwing out a chatbot is easy, but because of how old some of these data silos are and how segregated the healthcare system has been in the past. For example, you'll have an emergency unit. They acted all on their own with building spreadsheet, and this is not Cleveland, but just in general, having data in one silo, and then having the ICU over here, and late L&D over there. Every and some healthcare systems are very segmented. And you can't really take full advantage of AI until you figure out how to build some level of standardization and consolidation. And that's where I'm seeing across other clients that we serve, is where some challenges are. But on top of that, because it sits in those silos, you also are dealing with non-technical people, business people who their focus is on ambulatory, for example. There's a culture shift, and those folks don't understand the concept of data cleansing and data governance. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, Sarah, in the essence of getting to a more mature AI state, what cultural or structural changes need to happen for healthcare data to truly empower patients?
Yeah, one thing that's been super interesting to me is, because Cleveland Clinic's a global organization, being able to interact with my international markets that have a totally fundamentally different posture on data. For example, Cleveland Clinic London's in the UK. Like their HIPAA, like our HIPAA is their GDPR, and it's like almost the complete opposite mentality. Like patients have the right to be forgotten in the UK. Data needs to be stored, and there needs to be sovereignty of the data. And I think that's challenged me as a technologist to figure out how we're not only how are we going to meet those needs, but like what other possibilities are there out there to truly empower patients. And if provider organizations say, well, the data is ours, we own it, we're going to hoard that data, I think you're missing out on grand opportunities. One thing that Epic is working on, you may have heard of it, is called Cosmos. They're going to take all of the aggregated patient records across all of their customers, de-identify it, put it up in the cloud so that you can do not only research on it, but start to identify healthcare trends that may lead to new novel healthcare solutions. And so this idea that like we need to sort of just let go of like this idea that like the data is ours, it's actually our patients, and even more so, it's for the greater good. And so it's a really encouraging time to see some of that thinking, and again, directly tied back to AI, where now we finally have tools to be able to glean insights from that large, vast amount of data. Now, power, compute, energy is all going to be needed to make that happen at scale. So I do think we're certainly not out of the gate in terms of being able to, leverage those things in real time, but we're certainly headed well down the path, and it's, again, a really exciting time.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective that you said around, healthcare data has not really been used for bettering and maturing healthcare because it's so hidden and encrypted. And if we could figure out how to demask that and remove the critical data, the personal data, and move it into a environment where we can look across leveraging AI and learn, find patterns, things that we can do better. That's really interesting. I had not heard that. So.
Yeah, and what's super exciting to me to be at Cleveland Clinic, being an academic medical center, you literally have like research and education right along clinical care. And so the AMCs have been doing this for ages. How do we bring that mindset to the rest of the industry and say, like let's not keep these things in silos. Like how can we integrate the data between research and clinical care? The researchers can get more real-time information that can actually inform things like clinical trials, but then also like how do we then immediately pivot and be able to bring the latest and greatest clinical trial outcomes to our practicing clinicians. So it's truly and deeply felt at the core of kind of our tripartite focus.
That's great. So you're clearly very good at your job. You're clearly very well respected in the industry. Healthcare, technology. We get all that. Outside of milking cows and outside of Cleveland Clinic, tell the world, because we all want to know, who is Sarah Hatchett?
Well, I think one thing that I definitely try to embody in my leadership style is one of authenticity. So what you see is what you get. My team knows that. The organization knows that. I think that comes with the job. I think that's so important to be able to build that trust and respect of your team. Like, this is me. Like, I probably could do a little better job filtering sometimes. But this is it, right? This is who I am. And I actually deeply appreciate that Cleveland Clinic has, the core values that we ascribe to, and just this focus on being able to bring your authentic self to work and being able to kind of integrate. You don't have like a work Sarah and a home Sarah, right? You actually, we value and want to bring out of you the things that make you you, so that you can feel like fulfilled and happy and purpose driven, and not have to feel like there's this like mindset, It's not like Severance, where you have to clock in and you're one person and you go home and you don't even have memory. Like, we want that integrated life, and that's something I really try to build that culture around in IT.
I think that's good. You mentioned Severance. I've actually watched a couple of episodes and never really got into it. Do you watch that show? Is it pretty good?
I've watched season 1. Season 2 is on the list. I haven't got around to it yet, but yeah, it's an truly interesting thought experiment.
It is. You've mentioned to me in the past about your CHO. So I'm curious, A, what is a CHO and how has that partnership shaped your career?
Yeah, so that's referring to my husband, James. He's my absolutely amazing, partner in life. I think pretty early on in my career journey, we sort of saw the trajectories of where we were heading, and we wanted to start a family, and so we just sort of talked about like what are our unique gifts and talents, and like where is this all going, and like how are we going to manage to it. And I think we've established a really explicit sort of understanding of partnership. Like he is the chief operating officer of the home, happened to be the CIO of Cleveland Clinic. And I seriously believe the only way I can do what I do is because he handles that part of the business, if you will. Um, he's uniquely gifted in that space. We have two daughters, 15 and 10. They absolutely adore him, and there's studies out there that say like having an at-home dad builds resiliency and strength in your daughters. So yeah, he's a girl dad, and we manage to it, right? So I think it's it's been super productive and helpful in making sure that we both feel fulfilled in the day to day.
Yeah, I hope to meet James one day. Sounds pretty amazing. My understanding is you guys are planning a family trip to Japan. Um, this is where I believe you and your husband first connected in Japanese class. Um, and by the way, I just got back from Japan. As you know, NRI is a Japanese company, and I spent Anna, my partner, and I was spent 2 weeks traveling around. And Dan, the producer of this podcast, who you just met, is also going to Japan coming up. So apparently, it's a hot place to go. Um, Given that's where you and your husband really met, where you first connected, what does that full circle moment mean to you?
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually an awesome story. We both went to UW Madison for undergrad. I majored in English. He actually majored in Japanese. So we kind of joke like we spoke two different languages.
Mm.
Um, but it was a super intense program. And we actually formed a lot of relationships at that time because you had to spend so much time studying the Japanese language. It's obviously quite complex. But I think, the fact that he still, speaks it, watches anime. We're still fans of very much the culture. I think it, in some ways, became part of our story as a family as well. So I'm really excited to go take my family there next year so that my kids can really get a sense of the culture. When I've had a chance to travel to Asia, I just think that like it is just so different. Like you can't watch a show and get a sense of things. You actually literally have to go there and experience it. Even just the way that human bodies like interact with each other are different, and so being able to kind of bring that culture home, especially for my kids, I think is an awesome opportunity.
Do you have a favorite
I'll
anime?
have to get some tips from you about
Oh,
where's the best spots and the best meals.
oh, I've got tons of
They
them.
do they my kids do love sushi, so like we're not afraid of the raw stuff and all of that.
I've got tons of them. Anybody who's met me knows that Asia is my favorite place in the world. I spent 6 years in Singapore traveling. I was in a different country every week when I was covering sales for IBM. But Japan is certainly one of my favorite cultures and definitely favorite food. Anybody who has talked to me about my favorite foods, Katsu curry, find the best Katsu curry place and you will not be. It's like going for me. Katsu curry is like going to Waffle House.
Yes.
It is a comfort food and you can't go wrong. So it's so nice. So Sarah, you're the first female CIO at Cleveland Clinic. Then this is a space where I think women are still underrepresented, not just in healthcare, but across all industries. How do you see this landscape changing?
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly humbling to be the first, but I think it's even more important to not be the last. And I think of this role as less of like a milestone, but more of a responsibility to make it more real for the next generation to see themselves in these types of positions. And I think we are, right? Like we're seeing more women in technology and digital leadership, but also in adjacent spaces like data science, cybersecurity, AI, and that sort of thing. And I think this is where it's really important because inclusion shapes innovation. and you can't aspire to something that you can't see. And so if my presence helps bring someone into imagining a new path for themselves, that's really the most meaningful part of the job. I mean, it's always great to build each other up, but I think, specifically in that regard, making sure females know that this is an option. So I think the goal was to kind of like not just have a seat at the table, but like build a table so long that
Mm.
being first isn't a thing, right? That doesn't even matter anymore. And that's when we know that we'll have changed the landscape, when the leadership of a company reflects those who we serve.
Yeah, are there steps that organizations can take to make technology leadership more inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned kind of our Cleveland Clinic values, and I think, these sorts of things, organizations are coming out with these values, which I think is super empowering. But when you look at them, they're often qualities that were once considered secondary, right? So things like empathy and collaboration and even just vulnerability, like these are what are making organizations thrive. And so I think I see that shift as one of the most powerful forces in leadership today. Um, One of the books that I'm reading on Audible right now is Lead Bigger by Ann Chow, the former CEO of AT&T. And T. And I heard her speak, and I was just so inspired I had to buy her book. And she just talks about how leading bigger really is about inclusion, and that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because leaders intentionally create these systems that recognizes workers are humans. We all have companies. That's what a corporation is a bunch of humans. And if you champion values and purpose and seek to develop and sponsor talent that might otherwise be overlooked, that's where you're creating that more diverse, that more human and more collaborative culture. And honestly, that's not just good representation. That's good business, and it's good patient care.
Yeah, I agree. Do you agree that because we talked a little bit about the gender aspect of the female male, but I think inclusivity also includes things like culture, religion, race, and that's still other elements of um, you know within the technology space in the United States that we're still trying to overcome. And I think doing things like what you're doing with your children, taking them to Japan as an example, to experience other cultures, experience what life is like where the religion is different from a baseline perspective, or the food culture, or all of the different elements that come through growing up in a different society,
Yeah.
helps build a new generation.
Yeah, I mean,
So
I really think even today, like inclusion gets sort of like stuck over in like DEI land. Like it's over here. It's these metrics, or it's this stats that I need to meet. How do you pull it into kind of the day to day experience of work for people to know that their voice is heard, and that part of that comes from that humility of saying like, I don't have all the answers, right? Like
yeah.
I'm not always going to be the expert. I need people, and I need their diversity and their different perspectives and what they bring to the table, to really create those good outcomes. So it's you need to think more broadly and more fundamentally about it.
Any other advice you'd give to women or anyone who wants to step into technology leadership?
I mean, I do a fair amount of mentoring, and I think kind of like my 101 thing is like a lot of people think like they have to wait to become a manager. Like you have to wait to formally lead people to be considered a leader. And I just want to like completely debunk and demystify that. I think you can be a leader in your home, you can be a leader on your team without being the leader. I think being able to be self-aware that you're showing up in a space where you're actively working on developing your leadership skills, you are a leader. And I think the more intentional and more kind of getting that learning mindset of like you never like arrive, and even at this stage you never like arrive at leadership. You
Yeah.
never like, oh great, I'm a leader now, I'm done. Like even leaders like yourself and myself, like we're constantly working on growing our leadership skills. It's never like a one and done sort of thing. So it doesn't start in one spot and it doesn't end by any stretch. And so I think that the more people can just sort of realize that it is a journey, it's truly a journey, I think is empowering. I would hope.
That's spot on. That's really good advice. All right, let's move into fast takes, Sarah, where we're going to also dig in a little bit more about who Sarah Hatchett is. We're going to go through some quick questions. This is our last segment. So, you ready? First thing you do to reset after a tough day.
I'm not gonna lie. Some days it's a glass of red wine. Okay.
Woohoo!
But other than that, I mentioned I have kids, right? And so there's just lots of family time, active kids. They're very involved in sports and clubs. And actually, proud mom moment. My daughter's interviewing for her first job today.
Oh, that's awesome.
So we're very, very busy. Lots of carting around. I can't wait till she gets her driver's license. But one thing that I think is super important to us as a family is family dinner time. Like we try and make it a priority. Like we're still touching base, having a meal at the table, talking about our highs and lows of the day. Because I think that really gives me energy. Like this is why I'm doing what I'm doing.
I love that. And a lot of people in this day and age forget that family dinner time is so important. So I'm glad you're still doing that. Yeah. Next question. One book or podcast that's changed how you think about leadership.
Yes, I'm a big podcast nerd. I have a whole feed. I try to like mix in like, enriching fun things, but then also like the leadership things. One, I actually did a talk recently with Bill Russell from This Week Health. He does the 229 podcast. And I really love that because it gives folks like in my position to be able to learn from each other and kind of build a community without having to go to the big deal conferences. You can actually kind of check in and see how people are doing. I think healthcare is so important. Like I know every industry probably thinks they're special, but we think healthcare is special. So being able to hear directly from my peers who are doing awesome work is not only inspiring, but I actually take away some real practical tips.
Cool. All right. Next one. Favorite place you've traveled?
So this summer, I actually had the opportunity to go to India for the first time. And
That's right.
The only mistake I made was not staying long enough. I just really love the food and the history and the energy, but most of all the people. I mean, the hospitality was just absolutely fantastic. I would definitely go back.
Yeah, good one. I agree. I think India is a great place. Most underrated leadership trait?
I think through this talk, we've talked a lot about curiosity. And while I've brought it up several times, I have to admit, like it's something I'm working on. I think it's hard to find the time and the energy to truly be curious and to show up in a curious way, but it's going to unearth, different perspectives, different things that we've talked about. And I do think it's important to make sure people feel like you're truly invested in finding out their perspective, their input.
And you don't hear that a lot. Curiosity is a good takeaway. I love that. All right, last one. What would your walk-in theme song be?
I was trying to think of this. Isn't there like a "All I Do Is Win" that's been popular last year?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just so like I get so energized listening to it. So that's what I would do.
That definitely isn't a new song. I will say that is a song from our generation, but I do love that song. From shoveling snow and milking cows in Wisconsin to leading one of the world's top healthcare systems, Sarah's story reminds us that the best leaders don't just manage systems. They serve people, they stay curious, and they lead with conviction. So I encourage all of you to follow what Cleveland Clinic's innovative work is doing. Connect with Sarah on LinkedIn. And until next time, keep building boldly. Thanks, everyone.